script and asynchronous control flow with callbacks. Now in this session we are going to continue with promises in JavaScript. Here JavaScript promises. Here we are going to see that promises by considering one example. See this. Imagine that you are a top singer and fans ask day and night for your upcoming singles. So to get some relief, you promises to send them when it's published. You give your fans a list. They can fill their email addresses in this list so that when the song becomes available, all subscribed parties instantly receive it. And even if something goes very wrong, say like a fire in the studio, so that you can't publish the song, so they will still be notified because their list is there. Okay, that means they have subscribed your upcoming singles, okay, or your channel. So here in this case everyone is happy, like that singer is happy because that people don't crowd you anymore, and fans are happy because they won't miss the singles. Okay, so here this is a real life analogy for things we often have in programming. In programming, a producing code that does something and takes a time. For example, some code that loads the data over a network. In this example, consider a singer. That is, a singer is a like a producing code who are going to produce like singles. Okay, then a consuming code, that means that consuming code that wants the result of producing code once it is ready. Many functions may need that result, so these are the fans in this case. Okay, that we have seen the example of singer here producing. If we are considering the example of singer, that singer is the producing code and that fans are that consuming code. Okay, so here a promise is a special JavaScript object that links the producing code and the consuming code. That promise is going to link that producing code and consuming code together. So in terms of our analogy, this is the subscription list. That means the producing code takes whatever time it needs to produce the promised result, and the promise makes that result available to all of the subscribed code when it is ready. Okay, that promise make available the result or subscribe code when it is ready. Okay, after performing some operations on that producing code. Yeah, that means it is a subscription list that producing code takes whatever time it needs for producing some promised result, and that promise means it makes a result available to all that subscribed code. Okay, when it is ready, that is promises. The promises means a producing code is code that can take some time, and that consuming code that must wait for the result. And the promise is it is a JavaScript object that links producing code and consuming code. Then next point is JavaScript promise object. Here a JavaScript promise object contains both the producing code and calls to consuming code. Here you can see the syntax for promise. Here let promise is equals to new promise. See the variable promise is equals to new promise. Here you can see the promise function. Okay, then inside that we are going to write one function having parameters resolve and reject, and the body contains the executor. That executor contains the producing code. Here in this case, that producing code is a singer. We have seen the example of our singer. Okay, that's why consider the executor or that producing code is for singer. Sorry, here the function passed to a new promise is called executor. Here the promise function. Okay, function passed to the promise is called the executor. When the new promise is created, the executor runs automatically. Whenever we are going to create a new promise, The executor runs automatically. It contains the producing code, which should eventually produce the result. In terms of that analogy, we have seen that here in this case, the executor is the singer. Executor is singer. It its arguments like resolve and rejects are the callbacks. These are the callbacks provided by JavaScript itself. Our code is only inside this executor. Okay, we are going to write the code inside that executor. And this function contains resolve and reject parameters. These are the callbacks provided by the JavaScript. This is the syntax for promise. Then when the executor object, when the executor obtains the result, it may be earlier or late, that doesn't matter. It should call one of these callbacks. Which callbacks? We have seen it having two callbacks, resolve and rejects. Whenever we get the result, it should call one of these callbacks, like resolve, that means value, and reject, that means error. If that job finished successfully with the result value, if the job successfully finish, then we will get a value, result value. If any error occurred, that error is the error object, so it will return that error. So for summarizing this, that executor runs automatically and attempts to perform a job. When it is finished with the attempt, it calls a resolve. That means it will return the value, and if it was not successful, or it will, if it is rejected, then it will give an error. Okay, so that JavaScript promise object can be pending, fulfill, and rejected. It can be pending, fulfill, or rejected. The promise object supports two properties. The promised object support two properties, that is state and result. State and result. While the promise object is pending, that means working. While a promise object is pending, the result is undefined. If it is pending, the result is undefined. When a promise object is fulfilled, the result is a value. If it is fulfilled, that means that job is done successfully, then that result is a value. If when a promise object is rejected, if it is rejected, the result is an error object. Okay, so these are the three objects for promise, that is pending, fulfill, and rejected. Okay, so that promise objects written by some new promise constructor that has these internal properties like state and result. Initially pending, then changes to either fulfill when resolve is called, or rejected when reject is called. Okay, this is the state. That state may be initially it is pending, then it is changed to that fulfill if it is resolved, and it changes to rejected when it is rejected. Okay, and then second one is result. Initially it is undefined, then it changes to a value when it is resolved, and another result is error when it is rejected. Here you can see the JavaScript promise objects. Here that executor eventually moves promise to one of these three states. Pending here, whenever we are going to create a new promise or executor, that state is in pending and result is undefined. If it is resolved, then that state changes to fulfill and state, and that result is the value. And if it is rejected, then state is rejected and result is error. Then here now we are going to see how fan can subscribe to these changes. These changes, here is an example of promise constructor and a simple executor function with producing code that takes a time via set timeout method. Here you can see the example for promise constructor, that is let promise is equals to, we are going to create a new promise. Inside that function we are going to write the callback, resolve and reject. Here now you can see the function is executed automatically when the promise is constructed. After 1 second, a signal, 1 second signal, here we are going to set the timeout for 1 second. signal that the job is done with the result done here. Set timeout. Inside that, we are going to write resolve and done with the timer. Here we can see that the two things by running the code. We can see some two things after running this code, that is the executor is called automatically and immediately after creating new promise. Executor is called automatically, and executor receives two argument, that is resolve and reject. These functions are predefined by the javascript engine, so we don't need to create them. Okay, so we should only call one of them when it is ready. And after 1 second of processing, the executor calls resolve done. It will call after 1 second to produce the result. This changes the state of promise object. After executing this, it changes the state of promise object. Here you can see how it changes. Here, previously the state of that promise object is pending and result is undefined. After resolving, after 1 second, we are going to resolve that value is done here. Okay, then the state changes to fulfill and result is done. So this is the example of successful job completion, that is a fulfill promise. Now we are going to see for error promise. Okay, so now we are going to see the example of executor that is going to reject the promise with an error. So here you can see we are going to create a new promise with the callbacks resolve and reject. So after 1 second signal that the job is finished with an error. Here, set timeout. Now we are going to write the callback reject. Inside the bracket, we are going to create error. Oops. After 1 second. Okay. So here the call to reject moves the promise object to the reject state. Here we are going to summarize this like the executor should perform a job, usually something that takes some time. That is, here we are mentioned the time 1 second, and then call resolve or reject to change the state of corresponding promise object. So here a promise that is either resolved or reject is called, that is settled, as opposed to an initially pending promise. In this example, we are going to call that reject object here, reject callback, and we are going to give the error after 1 second, because of we are going to set the timeout here. After here you can see the state changes from whenever we are going to create a new promise, that is executor, that initial state is pending and result is undefined. After reject, here we are going to call that reject callback, reject callback here, that reject state. Okay, that executor is in rejecting the promise with an error. Okay, executor rejecting promise with an error, then state changes to rejected and result is error. Yeah, that's it for today's session. We will stop here. We have seen about promises, then promise objects, and their states pending, fulfill, and rejected. Okay, and we have seen the example for that executor, for fans, that is producing code and consuming code. Okay, yeah, we have seen that producing code and consuming code. We have seen the example for a singer and fans. That is, singer is the producing code and fans is the consuming code here. And we here. Okay, in this way we have finished with promises. We will stop here. Thank you.